You are listening to The Reference Desk, the Wicomico Libraries podcast that connects you to your public library.
Welcome back to the Wicomico County Libraries Reference Desk podcast. This month, it's going to be Beach Reads again. We're going to do this all summer. This week is the classics. We're officially halfway through the summer. Boo! But there's still plenty of time to get outside and enjoy the sunshine with a good book. In this series that we're calling Beach Reads, we'll be exploring 2 titles each month, one adult or YA, or young adult, and one for children. Each title is available on our online service, Hoopla, where all the titles are available to read immediately. This month our theme, as it were, is the classics, as I said. And for our children's collection, we have chosen to read an excerpt from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, a classic tale by C.S. Lewis, who was a contemporary of J.R.R. Tolkien of Lord of the Rings fame. You may have heard of him. For the adults and the YA, we are reading from Great Expectations. We're reading from Great Expectations by the one and only Charles Dickens. Both of these stories have also been adapted into films over the years several times over, with varying level of success. Let's start with our kids' selection. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. While this book is usually thought of as the first book in the series, it's actually second. Lewis wrote a companion book, a prequel called The Magician's Nephew, that establishes the creation of the world of Narnia and answers some origin questions. The series goes on for 5 more books, all the way to the end of the world, when the main character is changing out as they go. There are many subtle nuances that a young reader won't be able to pick up on, and that an older reader will, making this story a story that can be reread throughout your life. Without any further ado, let's jump on in. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis. Chapter 1. Lucy looks into a wardrobe. Once there were 4 children, whose names were Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy. This story is about something that happened to them when they were sent away from London during the war because of the air raids. They were sent to the house of an old professor who lived in the heart of the country, 10 miles from the nearest railway station and 2 miles from the nearest post office. He had no wife, and he lived in a very large house with a housekeeper called Mrs. Macready and 3 servants. Their names were Ivy, Margaret, and Betty, but they do not come into the story much. He himself was a very old man with shaggy white hair which grew over most of his face as well as on his head, and they liked him almost at once. But on the first evening when he came out to meet them at the front door, he was so odd-looking that Lucy, who was the youngest, was a little afraid of him, and Edmund, who was the next youngest, wanted to laugh and had to keep on pretending he was blowing his nose to hide it. As soon as they had said goodnight to the professor and gone upstairs on the first night, the boys came into the girls' room, and they all talked it over. "We've fallen on our feet and no mistake," said Peter. "This is going to be perfectly splendid. That old chap will let us do anything we like." "I think he's an old dear," said Susan. "Oh, come off it," said Edmund, who was tired and pretending not to be tired, which always made him bad-tempered. "Don't go on talking like that." "Like what?" said Susan. "And anyway, it's time you were in bed." "Trying to talk like mother," said Edmund. "And who are you to say when I'm going to go to bed?" "Go to bed yourself." "Hadn't we all better go to bed?" said Lucy. "There's sure to be a row if we're heard talking here." "No, there won't," said Peter. "I'll tell you. This is the sort of house where no one's going to mind what we do. Anyway, they won't hear us, and it's about 10 minutes' walk from here down to that dining room, and any amount of stairs and passages in between." "What's that noise?" said Lucy suddenly. It was a far larger house than she'd ever been in before, and the thought of all those long passages and rows of doors leading into empty rooms was beginning to make her feel a little creepy. "It's only a bird, silly," said Edmund. "It's an owl," said Peter. "This is going to be a wonderful place for birds. I shall go to bed now. I say, let's go and explore tomorrow. You might find anything in a place like this. Did you see those mountains as we came along? And the woods? There might be eagles. There might be stags. There will be hawks." "Badgers," said Lucy. "Foxes," said Edmund. "Rabbits," said Susan. But when next morning came, there was a steady rain falling, so thick that when you looked out the window you could see neither mountains nor the woods, nor even the stream in the garden. "Of course it would be raining," said Edmund. They had just finished their breakfast with the professor, and were upstairs in the room he had set apart for them, a long, low room with 2 windows looking out in one direction and 2 in another. "Do stop grumbling, Ed," said Susan. 10 to 1 it'll clear up in an hour or so. And in the meantime, we're pretty well off. There's a wireless and lots of books." "Not for me," said Peter. "I'm going to explore the house." Everyone agreed to this, and that was how the adventures began. It was the sort of house where you never seemed to come to the end of it, and it was full of unexpected places. The first few doors they tried led only into spare bedrooms, as everyone had expected they would. But soon they came to a very long room full of pictures, and there they found a suit of armor, and after that was a room all hung in green with a harp in one corner. And then came 3 steps down and 5 steps up, and then a kind of little upstairs hall and a door that led out onto a balcony, and then a whole series of rooms that led into each other and were lined with books, most of them very old, and some bigger than a Bible in a church. And shortly after that, they looked into a room that was quite empty except for one big wardrobe, the sort that had a looking glass in the door. There was nothing else in the room at all except a dead blue bottle on the windowsill. "Nothing there," said Peter, and they all trooped out again. All except Lucy. She stayed behind because she thought it would be worthwhile trying to open the door of the wardrobe, even though she felt almost sure that it would be locked. To her surprise, it opened quite easily, and 2 mothballs dropped out. Looking into the inside, she saw several coats hanging up, mostly long fur coats. There was nothing Lucy liked so much as the smell and feel of fur. She immediately stepped into the wardrobe and got in among the coats and rubbed her face against them, leaving the door open, of course, because she knew that it is very foolish to shut one's self into any wardrobe. Soon she went farther in and found that there was a second row of coats hanging behind the first one. It was almost quite dark in there, and she kept her arms stretched out in front of her so as not to bump her face into the back of the wardrobe. She took a step further in, then 2 or 3 steps, always expecting to feel woodwork against the tips of her fingers, but she could not feel it. This must be a simply enormous wardrobe, thought Lucy, going still further in and pushing the soft folds of the coats aside to make room for her. Then she noticed there was something crunching under her feet. "I wonder, is that more mothballs?" she thought, stooping down to feel it with her hand. But instead of feeling the hard, smooth wood of the floor of the wardrobe, she felt something soft and powdery and extremely cold. "This is very queer," she said, and went on a step or 2 further. Next moment, she found what was rubbing against her face and hands was no longer soft fur, but something hard and rough and even prickly. "Why, it is just like the branches of trees!" exclaimed Lucy. And then she saw that there was a light ahead of her, not a few inches away where the back of the wardrobe ought to have been, but a long way off. Something cold and soft was falling on her. A moment later, she found that she was standing in the middle of a wood at nighttime, with snow under her feet and snowflakes falling through the air. Lucy felt a little frightened, but she felt very inquisitive and excited as well. She looked back over her shoulder, and there, between the dark tree trunks, she could still see the open doorway of the wardrobe and even catch a glimpse of the empty room from which she had set out. She had, of course, left the door open, for she knew that it is a very silly thing to shut oneself into a wardrobe. It seemed to be still daylight there. "I can always get back if anything goes wrong," thought Lucy. She began to walk forward, crunch, crunch, over the snow and through the wood toward the other light. In about 10 minutes, she reached it and found it was a lamp post. As she stood looking at it, she wondered why there was a lamp post in the middle of a wood, and wondering what to do next, she heard the pitter-patter of feet coming toward her. And soon after that, a very strange person stepped out from among the trees and into the light of the lamp post. He was only a little taller than Lucy herself, and he carried her over his head an umbrella white with snow. From the waist upward he was like a man, but his legs were shaped like a goat. The hair on them was glossy black, and instead of feet he had goat's hooves. He also had a tail, but Lucy did not notice this at first because it was neatly caught up over his arm that held the umbrella so as to keep it from trailing in the snow. He had a red woolen muffler around his neck, and his skin was rather reddish too. He had a strange but pleasant little face with a short pointed beard and curly hair, and out of the hair stuck 2 horns, one on each side of his forehead. One of his hands, as I have said, held the umbrella. In the other arm he carried several brown paper parcels. What with the parcels in the snow, it looked just as if he had been doing his Christmas shopping. He was a fawn, and when he saw Lucy he gave such a start of surprise that he dropped all his parcels. "Goodness gracious me!" exclaimed the fawn. And that's the end of chapter 1. If you want to continue reading about Lucy's adventures in this magical world beyond the wardrobe and see who this goat man is, please feel free to go to Hoopla Digital and log in with your library card, and you can absolutely get access to the books for free immediately, and you can finish this. And also the rest of the series, I believe, is also available, so you can continue with their adventures as well. So the next book we're going to read is going to be for the adults. Let's take a quick look at the Great Expectations, written by the great Charles Dickens. You may have been required to read this for high school or college literature class, and it was assigned for a good reason. Dickens was brilliant at describing scenes, clothing, food, and setting up plot devices. There's a good explanation for his wordiness, though. Charles Dickens originally published a lot of his work in periodicals of the time, like magazines and such. These publications paid not by the piece of work, but by the word, making it worth his time and energy and paper consumption to make his work as verbose as possible, as they say, using 10 words when 2 would do. Great Expectations is above all a coming-of-age story. It highlights the personal growth of the main character, called Pip, and all the events that shaped his life. Without further ado, let's get into Great Expectations. As an aside, I am absolutely terrible at doing a British accent, but some of the dialogue tends to be written with a Cockney bent, so I'm going to do my very best. No promises, and please don't come at me. Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. Chapter 1. My father's family name being Pirrip, and my Christian name Philip, my infant tongue could make of both names nothing longer or more explicit than Pip. So I called myself Pip, and came to be called Pip. I gave Pirrip as my father's family name on the authority of his tombstone and my sister, Mrs. Joe Gargery, who married the blacksmith. As I never saw my father or my mother, and never saw any likeness of either of them, for their days were long before the days of photographs, my first fancies regarding what they were like were unreasonably derived from their tombstones. The shapes of the letters on my father's gave me an odd idea that he was a square, stout, dark man with curly black hair. From the character and turn of the inscription, also Georgiana, wife of the above, I drew a childish conclusion that my mother was freckled and sickly. To 5 little stone lozenges, each about 1.5 feet long, which were arranged in a neat row beside their grave, and were sacred to the memory of 5 little brothers of mine, who gave up trying to get a living exceedingly early in that universal struggle. I am indebted for a belief I religiously entertain, that they had all been born on their backs, with their hands in their trousers pockets, and never taken them out in this state of existence. Ours was the marsh country, down by the river, within, as the river wound, 20 miles of the sea. My first most vivid and broad impression of the identity of things seems to me to have been gained on a memorable raw afternoon toward evening. At such time I found out for certain that this bleak place, overgrown with nettles, was a churchyard, and that Philip Pirrip, late of this parish, and also Georgiana, wife of the above, were dead and buried, and that Alexander, Bartholomew, Abraham, Tobias, and Roger, infant children of the aforesaid, were also dead and buried, and that the dark, flat wilderness beyond the churchyard, intersected with dikes and mounds and gates, with scattered cattle feeding on it, was the marshes, and that the low, leaden line beyond was the river, and that the distant savage lair from which the wind was rushing was the sea, and that the small bundle of shivers growing afraid of it all, and beginning to cry, was Pip. "Hold your noise," cried a terrible voice, as a man stared up from among the graves at the side of the church porch. "Keep still, you little devil, or I'll cut your throat." A fearful man, all in coarse gray, with a great iron on his leg, a man with no hat, and with broken shoes, and with an old rag tied around his head, a man who had been soaked in water and smothered in mud, and lamed by stones, and cut by flints, and stung by nettles, and torn by briars, who limped and shivered and glared and growled, and whose teeth chattered in his head as he seized me by the chin. "Oh, don't cut my throat, sir," I pleaded in terror. "Pray don't do it, sir." "Tell us your name, quick," said the man. "Pip, sir." "Once more," said the man, staring at me. "Give it mouth." "Pip, Pip, sir." "Show us where you live," said the man. "Pint out the place." I pointed out to where the village lay, on the flat inshore among the alder trees and pollards, a mile or more from the church. The man, after looking at me for a moment, turned me upside down and emptied my pockets. There was nothing in them but a piece of bread. When the church came to itself, for he was so sudden and strong that it made my head go over my heels before me, I saw the steeple under my feet. When the church came to itself, I say, I was seated on a high tombstone, trembling while he ate the bread ravenously. "You young dog," said the man, licking his lips, "what fat cheeks you got." I believed they were fat, though I was at that time undersized for my years and not strong. "Darn me if I could eat 'em," said the man, with a threatening shake of his head, "and if I hadn't half a mind to do it." I earnestly expressed my hope that he wouldn't, and held tighter to the tombstone on which he had put me, partly to keep myself upon it, partly to keep myself from crying. "Now looky here," said the man. "Where's your mother?" "There, sir," said I. He started, made a short run, and stopped and looked over his shoulder. "There, sir," I timidly explained. "Also Georgiana, that's my mother." "Oh," said he, coming back. "And that's your father, or longer your mother?" "Yes, sir," said I. "Him too, late of this parish." "Ha," he muttered then, considering. "Who d'ye live with, supposing you're kindly let to live, which I hadn't made my mind about?" "My sister, sir, Mrs. Joe Gargery, wife of Joe Gargery, the blacksmith, sir." "Blacksmith, eh?" said he, and he looked down at his leg. After darkly looking at his leg and me for several times, he came closer to my tombstone, took me by both arms, and tilted me back as far as he could hold me, so that his eyes looked most powerfully down into mine, and mine looked most helplessly up into his. "Now looky here," he said, "the question being whether you're to let live. You know what a file is?" "Yes, sir." "And you know what whittles is?" "Yes, sir." After each question, he tilted me over a little more, so as to give me a greater sense of helplessness and danger. "You get me at file," he tilted me again, "and you get me whittles," he tilted me again. "You bring them both to me," he tilted me again, "or I'll have your heart and liver out," he tilted me again. I was dreadfully frightened and so giddy that I clung to him with both hands and said, "If you would kindly please to let me keep upright, sir, perhaps I shouldn't be sick, and perhaps I could attend more." He gave me a most tremendous dip and roll, so that the church jumped over its own weathercock, and then he held me by the arms in an upright position on the top of the stone, and went on in these fearful terms. "You bring to me tomorrow, morning early, that file and them whittles. You bring the lot to me, and at the old battery over yonder. You do it, and you never dare say a word, or dare to make a sign concerning your having seen such a person as me, or any person somever, and you shall be let to live. You fail, or you go from my words or any particular, no matter how small it is, and your heart and your liver shall be tore out, roasted, and ate. Now, I ain't alone, as you may think I am. There's a young man hid with me, in comparison with which young man I am an angel. That young man hears the words I speak. That young man has a secret way peculiar to himself of getting at a boy, and his heart and his liver. It was in vain for a boy to attempt to hide himself from that young man. A boy may lock his door, may warm his bed, may tuck himself up, may draw the clothes up over his head, may think himself comfortable and safe, but that young man will creep softly, creep his way to him and tear him open. I am keeping that young man from harming you at the present moment with great difficulty. I find it very hard that the young man off your inside. I find it very hard to hold that young man off your inside. Now, what do you say?" I said that I would get him the file, and I would get him that broken bits of food I could, and I would come to him at the battery early in the morning. "Say Lord strike you dead if you don't," said the man. I said so, and he took me down. "Now," he pursued, "you remember what you undertook, and you remember that young man, and you get home." Good night, sir," I faltered. "Much a lad," he said, glancing about him over the cold, wet flat. "I wish I was a frog, or an eel." At the same time, he hugged his shuddering body with both arms, clasping himself, as if to hold himself together, and limped toward the low church wall. As I saw him go, picking his way among the nettles, among the brambles and the bound and the green mounds, he looked into my young eyes as if he were eluding the hands of dead people, stretching up cautiously out of their graves, to get twist upon his ankle and pull him in. When he came to the low church wall, he got over it, like a man whose legs were numbed and stiff, and then he turned round to look at me. When I saw him turning, I set my face toward home, and made the best use of my legs. But presently I looked over my shoulder and saw him going once again toward the river, still hugging himself in both arms, and picking his way with his sore feet among the great stones dropped into the marshes here and there, for stepping places when the rain, where the tide was in. The marshes were just long, black horizontal line then, as I stopped to look after him, and the river was just another horizontal line, not nearly so broad, nor yet so black. And the sky was just a row of long, angry red lines, and dense black lines intermixed. On the edge of the river, I could faintly make out the only two black things in all the prospect that seemed to be standing upright. One of these was the beacon, by which the sailors steered, like an unhooped cask on a pole, an ugly thing when you were near it. The other, a gibbet, with some chains hanging to it, which had once held a pirate. The man was limping on toward this ladder, as if he were the pirate come to life and come down and going back to hook himself up again. It gave me a terrible turn when I thought so, and as I saw the cattle lifting their head to gaze over him, I wondered that they thought so too. I looked all around for the horrible young man and could see no signs of him, but now I was frightened again and ran home without stopping. If you want to continue reading about the adventures of Pip in London I think it's set in the late 1800s, because he alludes to early 1800s, because he alludes to photography not being a thing yet, but it is something that happens in the narrator's later life. I'm guessing around the early 1800s, which is about the time Charles Dickens was alive anyway. You're welcome to go check that out as well on Hoopla. Check it out, because it's a pretty cool story. It's a little dark, but it doesn't necessarily have a happy ending, but it does have an ending that is fairly satisfactory. Thanks for joining us today for our Beach Reads Classics Edition. The classics have so much to offer us. They can give us insights on where we've come as a culture, as well as how we can move forward. This month we've stuck with British classics, but we encourage you to branch out. Check out Tolstoy's War or Peace, Homer's The Iliad, or Sun Tzu's The Art of War. World travel is tough at the moment, logistically speaking, and reading the classics, even modern literature of a different part of the world, can offer great insight into the culture without having to go through the hassle of plane travel, COVID tests, and long lines. Happy reading, and don't forget the sunscreen.
Future episodes may feature a variety of topics, ranging from storytelling, arts and crafts, reader's advisory, reference questions, discussion, and more. We also encourage feedback through our Facebook page or in the comments section on the podcast. Visit us online at www.wicomicolibraries.org. Search for Wicomico Libraries on your favorite podcasting site. You can call us at 410-546-5397, or you can email us at center@wicomico.org. That is CENTRE @wicomico.org.